In a quiet village, nestled between mango groves and red dust roads that turned to rivers when the sky wept, there lived a couple whose only child had 4 legs and a wagging tail. Their names were Mami Tayo and Baba Tayo, and their hearts had been woven together by 27 years of love, laughter, and the quiet ache of waiting for what never came. This child of theirs was called Taju, a brown village mutt with patches of gold on his chest and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ancestors. He was no ordinary dog, the villagers would say, watching how he understood every word spoken to him, how he comforted the grieving and played gently with children. But none of them knew that one storm, fierce and unforgiving, would reveal just how extraordinary Taju really was. On that night, the sky roared like a forgotten god awakening from slumber. Thunder rattled the corrugated iron roofs until they sang like drums, and rain hissed down like secrets the earth had buried too long. In the distance, real drums pulsed from the village square, the elders calling on the ancestors to calm the storm. Palm fronds whipped against windows, and chickens scattered into whatever shelter they could find. Mommy clutched Baba's weathered hand, her eyes scanning their small compound through the darkness. The gate swung on its hinges, creaking a mournful song. "Taju," she whispered, her voice trembling like leaves in the wind. They thought they had lost their dog that night. They didn't know the heavens were preparing to send them something else in return, something that would change their lives forever and cost them the most important thing they held so dear. Mommy was 47, with laughter lines etched deep around her eyes from years of smiling through both joy and sorrow. Every morning before dawn, she would tie her colorful wrapper tight around her waist and head to the village market, where she sold groundnuts roasted to perfection and bars of homemade soap that smelled of palm oil and hope. Her hands, calloused from years of work, yet gentle as a mother's touch, wrapped each purchase with the same care she might use to swaddle a baby. "Take this one," she would tell her customers, selecting the largest groundnuts. "It's for good luck." And somehow, her customers always seemed to leave her stall feeling lighter, as if they had bought more than nuts and soap, as if they had purchased a small piece of her generous heart. Baba Tayo, at 50, was a school teacher with a voice that never needed to rise above a whisper to command attention. His students adored him, this gentle man who graded their papers under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp each evening, writing encouraging notes in the margins, even when the answers were wrong. "Try again tomorrow," he would write. "The path to wisdom is paved with beautiful mistakes." Their home was modest. Mud walls painted white, a corrugated iron roof that drummed with rain, raffia mats on concrete floors, and a creaky veranda where they spent their evenings watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a house built for children's laughter, for tiny feet running through the rooms, for school uniforms hanging on the line and toys scattered in the corners. But the children never came. For 27 years, Mommy and Baba Tayo had waited. They had visited medicine men who promised miracles in bottles, prayed at churches and mosques, traveled to distant shrines where other desperate couples left offerings of kola nuts and white cloths. Each month brought hope, then disappointment, then hope again, like waves washing over the same shore. "Perhaps the children we're meant to haven't found their way to us yet," Mommy would sometimes whisper to Baba in the darkness of their bedroom. And Baba, wise in his quiet way, would pull her close and say, "Then we wait with open hearts, my love. Good things come to those who keep room in their lives for miracles." That room in their lives was filled by Taju. They had found him, or rather, he had found them, on a morning when the Harmattan winds brought dust and possibilities from the north. He was barely 8 weeks old then, a shivering bundle of brown fur with oversized paws and ribs that showed through his coat. He had appeared at their gate as if summoned, looking up at them with eyes that seemed to say, "I've been looking everywhere for you." Mommy fell in love first, as she always did with things that needed caring for. She scooped up the puppy, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her palm, and something in her chest that had been closed for years suddenly opened wide. "Look, Baba," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look what the morning brought us." Baba, who had taught himself to be cautious with hope, found himself reaching out to scratch behind the puppy's ears. The little dog immediately pressed into his touch, a sound somewhere between a purr and a sigh escaping his throat. "He's chosen us," Baba said simply, and that was that. They named him Taju, which meant crown in their language, because from the moment he arrived, he ruled their hearts like a benevolent king. They celebrated his birthday each year with roasted yams and a new collar, Mommy tying it around his neck with a ceremony fit for royalty. "Our prince deserves the best," she would declare, and Baba would chuckle, watching Taju prance around the compound as if he understood exactly how special he was. Each morning began the same way. Mommy would rise with the sun, her wrapper tied snug around her waist, and kindle the fire to roast her groundnuts. The smoke would curl up into the morning air, carrying the scent of toasted nuts throughout the compound. And always Taju would be there beside her, his warm body pressed against her legs, his tail creating its own small windstorm of joy. "Good morning, my prince," Mommy would whisper, and Taju would respond by nudging her hand with his wet nose, as if to say, "Good morning, Mama. What adventures await us today?" He was her shadow at the market, lying patiently beside her stall while she called out her wares. "Fresh groundnuts, soap that makes your skin soft like a baby's." Children would sneak him pieces of meat pie when their mothers weren't looking, and Taju would accept these gifts with the gracious dignity of one who understood he was loved by an entire village. But he was clever too, perhaps too clever. Sometimes Mommy would turn her back for just a moment, and when she looked again, a handful of groundnuts would be missing, and Taju would be sitting a few feet away, his expression the picture of innocence, except for the telltale crumbs around his mouth. "You rascal," Mommy would laugh, shaking her finger at him. "One day I'm going to tie you up so you can't steal from your own mother." But they both knew she never would. How could she punish him for being exactly what they had prayed for? A child who filled their home with mischief and joy. Back at the house, Baba would be grading papers at his wooden desk, the one that wobbled unless you put a folded piece of paper under the short leg. He would hear Mommy's laughter carrying across the compound and smile to himself, calling out, "That dog is too clever for us, my love. We should have named him Professor." The village children walking past on their way to school would peek through the gaps in the fence and giggle at Taju's antics. "There goes the couple with the dog child," they would whisper, but not unkindly. In their small community, everyone knew everyone's story, and Mommy and Baba's love for their unusual child had become part of the village's own folklore. Evenings were sacred in their household. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples, the family would gather on their veranda. The sounds of the village settling into night would drift over them, goats bleating in the distance, children being called in for supper, and the rhythmic pounding of mortars as women prepared the evening meal. Mommy would feed Taju from her own hands, his rough tongue warm against her fingers as he gently took pieces of yam or rice. Baba would join them, settling into the creaky wooden chair he had inherited from his father, his arm naturally finding its way around Mommy's shoulders. These were the moments when their love felt most complete. Not the passionate fire of their youth, but something deeper and more enduring. It was the love of shared silences, of knowing exactly how the other person took their tea, of finding joy in the ordinary miracle of another day spent together. One evening, when the harmattan had been particularly harsh and Mommy's market earnings were lower than usual, She sat on the veranda with worry lines creasing her forehead. "The rains were late this year," she said quietly. "People don't have extra money for groundnuts when they're worried about feeding their families." Baba was quiet for a long moment, then disappeared into the house. When he returned, he was carrying his old radio, the one his students had pooled their money to buy him years ago, the one that brought him news from the capital and music on lonely nights. "What are you doing?" Mommy asked, watching him wrap it carefully in cloth. "Taju needs a proper blanket for the rainy season," Baba said simply. "This radio will fetch enough money at the market." Tears filled Mommy's eyes. "But you love that radio. You listen to the news every evening." Baba kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "He's family, my love. Family comes first." And when he returned the next day with a thick, colorful blanket that smelled of fresh cotton, Taju seemed to understand the sacrifice that had been made for him. He curled up on his new blanket, then got up and carefully dragged it over to where Mommy and Baba sat, spreading it across their feet before settling down on top of it, as if to say, "What's mine is yours, because we are family." The storm came without warning, as storms often do in that part of the world. One moment the air was still and heavy, thick with the promise of rain, and the next the sky had opened like a wound, pouring forth its fury upon the earth below. It began as whispers, a gentle tapping on the roof, the kind of sound that usually brought smiles to the faces of farmers and mothers alike. But within minutes, those whispers became screams. The wind picked up, bending the palm trees until their fronds nearly touched the ground. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled across the village like the footsteps of giants. Mommy woke first, her heart racing from a dream she couldn't remember. The house shook with each clap of thunder, and rain hammered against the windows like desperate fingers trying to get in. She reached for Baba, finding comfort in his solid warmth beside her. "Listen to that storm," she whispered. But Baba was already awake, his hand finding hers in the darkness. It was then that Mommy noticed the silence where there should have been the soft sound of Taju's breathing from his usual spot at the foot of their bed. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding for a different reason. "Taju?" she called softly, not wanting to wake the neighbors but needing to know where he was. No answering whimper. No rustle of movement from the living room where he sometimes slept when the nights were too warm. Baba was up now too, lighting the kerosene lamp with practiced movements. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as they searched the house, room by room. The kitchen, empty. The living room, empty. Even the small storage room where Taju sometimes hid during thunderstorms, empty. It was when they reached the front door that Mommy's heart truly began to race. The wooden gate that enclosed their compound stood wide open, swinging back and forth on its hinges like a mouth gasping for air. The wind had torn it loose from its latch, and now it creaked and groaned with each gust. "Taju!" she called out into the storm, her voice immediately swallowed by the wind and rain. She stepped toward the gate, but Baba caught her arm. "My love, you can't go out in this," he said, his voice steady but his eyes wide with worry. "He's clever, our Taju. He'll find shelter somewhere and come back when the storm passes." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, both of them knew that Taju had never run away before, never left their compound without them. In 5 years, he had been as constant as the sunrise, as reliable as their love for each other. Mommy pulled her wrapper tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the rain anyway. The water was shockingly cold, soaking through her clothes in seconds. "Taju!" she called again, louder this time, desperation creeping into her voice. The village around them was a chaos of mud and rushing water. The rain had turned the red dust roads into rivers, and debris floated past their gate, pieces of roofing, broken branches. Meanwhile, unknown to his frantic parents, Taju was fighting his own battle against the storm. He had been caught outside when the first drops fell, investigating an interesting scent near the forest edge that bordered their village. What had started as curiosity had quickly become a fight for survival as the gentle rain transformed into a deluge. The floodwaters rose quickly, turning the familiar paths into treacherous streams. Taju's paws slipped on mud-slicked stones as he tried to find his way back home, but the water was moving too fast, carrying him further from everything he knew and loved. It was then that he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through cloth. A cry, high and desperate and unmistakably human. A baby's wail carried on the wind from deep within the forest. Every instinct told Taju to keep fighting toward home, toward the warm, dry safety of Mommy and Baba's arms. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something deeper than instinct took over. Taju turned away from home and plunged deeper into the storm, following that desperate cry toward whatever waited for him in the darkness of the forest. Dawn came slowly, as if reluctant to reveal the damage the storm had done. The rain had stopped, but the air still hummed with electricity, and steam rose from the soaked earth like the breath of some great, sleeping creature. In this strange green light that filtered through the forest canopy, everything looked different, transformed, otherworldly. It was in this eerie calm that Taju found the miracle. There, caught against a fallen log in what had once been a small stream but now was a rushing river, lay a bundle wrapped in cloth. At first, Taju thought it might be debris. The storm had scattered so many strange things throughout the forest.
But then the bundle moved, and a tiny fist emerged from the wrapping, and Taju's heart nearly stopped. A baby. A human baby, barely alive, its skin blue with cold. The cloth was a familiar pattern, one of the bright, printed fabrics the village women wore, but the fabric was torn and muddy now, offering little protection against the elements. How the baby had ended up here, in the deepest part of the forest, was a mystery that would never be solved. Perhaps its mother had been caught in the storm while traveling. Perhaps there had been an accident, a moment of panic when survival meant making impossible choices. The forest kept its secrets, and the baby was too young to tell its story. What mattered now was that the child was alive, though barely, and completely alone in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous. Taju approached carefully, his own body shaking from cold and exhaustion. The gash on his left hind leg, where a piece of flying debris had caught him during his journey through the storm, throbbed with each step. Blood had mixed with mud and rainwater, making his brown fur dark and matted, but he ignored his own pain as he gently nudged the baby with his nose, whimpering softly. The baby's mouth opened in what might have been a cry, but no sound emerged. It was weakening quickly, and Taju knew with the certainty that comes from pure love that he had very little time. Carefully, so carefully that he barely dared to breathe, Taju gripped the edge of the baby's wrapping in his teeth. The fabric was slippery and waterlogged, and his injured leg made it difficult to maintain his balance, but somehow he managed to lift the precious bundle without dropping it. The journey back towards the village was the longest of Taju's life. Each step was agony, not just from his physical injuries, but from the weight of responsibility he carried. This wasn't just any baby. This was someone's miracle, someone's answered prayer, someone's whole world wrapped in muddy cloth. And for reasons he couldn't understand but accepted completely, it had been placed in his care. Thorns caught at his fur and tore new wounds in his skin. His injured leg gave out several times, sending him sprawling. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full extent of the storm's damage. Trees lay across paths, roofs had been torn from houses, and everywhere there was the detritus of a community that had been shaken and scattered by forces beyond its control. But Taju pressed on, driven by something larger than himself, something that connected him to every parent who had ever fought to protect their child, every soul who had ever chosen love over safety, sacrifice over survival. By the time he reached the edge of the village, His strength was nearly gone, his vision blurred, and his legs shook with each step. The baby in his mouth seemed to weigh as much as a boulder, though it couldn't have been more than a few pounds. But ahead of him, through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he could see the familiar shape of home, the whitewashed walls, the corrugated roof, the veranda where he had spent so many peaceful evenings. Just a little further, just a few more steps. Mommy and Baba Tayo sat on their veranda, tired, but unwilling to give up hope. Mommy, huddled in a blanket and straining to see through the darkness, scanned the compound and the road beyond for any sign of movement. Baba had tried to convince her to come inside, to rest, to eat something, but she had refused. What if he comes back and we're not watching? What if he needs us and we're not here? So Baba had brought her tea and a blanket, and then settled into the chair beside her to keep vigil together. They'd sat in silence mostly, holding hands, both lost in their own prayers and fears. It was Mommy who saw the shape first, a dark form moving slowly along the road, weaving slightly as if drunk or injured. At first, she thought it might be a person, perhaps someone else who had been caught in the storm and was now making their way home. But there was something familiar about the movement, something that made her heart leap into her throat. "Taju," she whispered, hardly daring to hope. The shape stopped at the sound of her voice, and even from a distance she could see him. Baba was right behind her, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was definitely Taju. He could tell by the familiar brown coat, the particular way our dog held his head. But something was wrong. Taju was moving too slowly, favoring one leg, and there was something in his mouth, something he was carrying with infinite care. As they got closer, the truth hit them both at the same moment, stopping them in their tracks. Taju was carrying a baby.
A human baby, wrapped in muddy cloth, cradled as gently in his jaws as if it were made of the most delicate glass. The child was so small, so still, that for a moment Mommy thought it might be too late, that whatever miracle Taju had found had already slipped away. But then the baby moved, just slightly, and let out a cry so soft it was barely audible above the sound of dripping water and distant voices. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Mommy breathed, falling to her knees in the mud. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Taju reached them, his fur caked with mud, his left hind leg dragging. There was not just the fresh wound on his leg, but scratches and cuts all over his body, evidence of a journey that had cost him dearly. With infinite gentleness, he lowered his head and placed the baby in Mommy's outstretched arms. The child was warm, somehow, miraculously still warm, and as she pulled back the muddy cloth, she saw a face that was perfect in every detail. Dark skin, long eyelashes, a tiny nose and lips that moved slightly as if trying to form words. "He's alive," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Baba, he's alive." Baba knelt beside Taju, his hands trembling as he examined our dog's injuries. "You did it, didn't you, boy?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Taju's tail wagged once, weakly, and he tried to lick Baba's hand. But the effort seemed to drain the last of his strength. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto his side, his breathing shallow and labored. "No," Mommy said, still cradling the baby but reaching out to touch him. The light that had always shone in his eyes began to fade like a lamp running out of oil. He looked at her one last time, and in that look she saw everything. His love for them, his joy at having completed his mission, his peace at knowing that the baby was safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her tears falling onto his fur. "Thank you for bringing him to us. Thank you for being the best son any parents could ask for." Taju's eyes closed, and with a final gentle sigh, he was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the baby seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment and grew quiet in Mommy's arms. In the distance, the village was waking up, people emerging from their homes to assess the storm's damage.
But here in this small circle of love and loss, time seemed suspended. It was the baby's sudden cry, loud and strong and demanding, that broke the spell. The sound seemed to pierce the morning air like a bell, announcing to the world that a new life had arrived, that hope had survived the storm. The little dog who had walked through hell, who had carried a child through the storm to safety, had given his life so that other might live. When the authorities arrived, the village chief, the police, the social workers who dealt with abandoned children, they found a community in awe. No one knew where the baby came from. No one had reported a missing child. The storm had been so fierce, so widespread, that it was impossible to say from which direction Taju might have carried his precious cargo. "It's as if he appeared from the sky," said one of the elders, shaking his gray head in wonder. Another elder, an old woman whose words carried weight throughout the village, nodded sagely. "Some dogs are just dogs, but some dogs are angels in disguise, sent to teach us about love and sacrifice. This Taju, he was no ordinary dog." The paperwork took weeks. There were forms to fill out, interviews to conduct, background checks to complete. But every single person involved in the process, from the chief to the local police, felt a profound sense of rightness about the baby staying with Mommy and Baba Tayo. "The dog brought him to you, she," the lead social worker said, simply, when she handed Mommy and Baba the final papers. "In all my years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if he was meant to be yours." They named him Tajudeen, Crown of Faith, partly in honor of the dog who had brought them to them, and partly because his arrival had crowned their faith in love's power to work miracles. From the beginning, Tajudeen seemed to understand that he was special, that his very presence in their home was a gift not to be taken lightly. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh, but there was also a seriousness about him, a depth in his dark eyes that reminded everyone who saw him of his miraculous arrival.
Mommy threw herself into motherhood with the passion of someone who had waited 27 years for the privilege. She sang to him while she cooked, carried him with her to the market, told him stories about his brother Taju, who loved him enough to bring him home. Whether these stories were true didn't matter. They became true in the telling, woven into the fabric of Tajudeen's identity as surely as if they had been written in his DNA. Baba, meanwhile, discovered that being a father suited him perfectly. He would sit for hours with Tajudeen on his lap, grading papers with one hand while the baby slept against his chest. His students, who had always loved their gentle teacher, were enchanted by the story of how he and Mommy had become parents, and they adopted baby Tajudeen as their classroom mascot. "Mr. Teo," one student asked during a lesson about heroes and legends, "do you think Taju was watching over Tajudeen from heaven?" Baba paused in his writing on the chalkboard and looked out the window toward his home, where he knew Mommy was probably feeding the baby or singing him to sleep. "I think," he said carefully, "that love doesn't end when someone dies. I think it transforms into something else, something that keeps protecting the people we love." The first few months with Tajudeen were a blur of sleepless nights and moments of joy so acute, but they were also the most magical times when Tajudeen would wake in the early hours and Mommy would feed him by lamplight, telling him stories about his canine brother. He was brown like rich earth after rain, with eyes that sparkled like stars. And he loved us so much that when he heard you cry in the forest, he knew he had to bring you home no matter what it cost him. As Tajudeen grew from baby to toddler, his personality began to emerge. He was curious like Taju had been, always exploring, always getting into gentle mischief. He was loyal like Taju, following Mommy and Baba everywhere, content to simply be in their presence. And he was protective like Taju, somehow sensing when either his parents were sad or worried and offering comfort in his own small ways. The village celebrated his first birthday with a festival that lasted 3 days. Everyone contributed something: food, music, stories, blessings. It was as if the entire community had adopted the child too,
seeing him as a living testament to the power of love and sacrifice. They took Tajudeen to the small mound beneath the mango tree where Taju was buried. The wooden marker was weathered now, softened by months of rain and sun, but the words were still clear. Here lies Taju, loyal, loving, and heaven sent. You gave us what the world couldn't. Tajudeen reached out with one chubby hand and touched the stone, and for a moment, everyone watching swore they could feel a presence there, warm, protective, and infinitely loving. The child smiled as if he had been greeted by an old friend, and then wandered off to investigate a butterfly, leaving the adults to wonder at what they had witnessed. Years passed, as years do, and the story of Taju and the miracle baby became part of the village's oral tradition. Children who hadn't even been born when it happened grew up knowing every detail, and visitors to the village were often taken to see the mango tree where the loyal dog was buried. Tajudeen grew into a bright, thoughtful boy who excelled at school and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of other people's feelings. He was polite and kind and had a mischievous twinkle in his eye that reminded Mommy and Baba so much of their first son. On quiet evenings, when the three of them sat together on the veranda where Taju used to sleep, Mommy and Baba would tell their son about his arrival into their lives, how they had waited so long for him, how Taju had loved them all so much that he had been willing to give his life to bring their family together. "Do you remember him at all?" Mommy asked one evening when Tajudeen was 7 years old and beginning to ask deeper questions about his origins. Tajudeen was quiet for a long moment, swinging his legs from the chair that had once been too big for him but now fit perfectly. He said, "Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I think I can remember being carried, not by a person, but by someone who loved me very much, someone warm and safe." He paused, looking out at the mango tree where fireflies were beginning to dance in the gathering dusk, "And sometimes I dream about a dog with kind eyes who tells me stories about his family, about a woman who makes the best groundnuts." Mommy and Baba exchanged a look, their hearts full. They had no explanation for what passed between them now, but it was a mixture of wonder, gratitude, and the kind of love that transcends understanding. "I think," Baba said softly, "that love creates connections that death can't break. And I think some souls are so intertwined that they recognize each other across any distance, even the distance between life and whatever comes after." As in response to his words, a gentle breeze stirred the mango leaves above them, and for just a moment, they could swear they heard the sound of a dog's contented sigh carried on the evening air. The talking drums began their nightly rhythm from the village square, their deep voices telling stories that stretched back generations, stories of love and loss, sacrifice and redemption, the endless cycle of endings that become beginnings. And in that ancient music, those who listened closely might have heard a new verse being added to the eternal song, the story of a dog who carried a miracle and the family whose love was strong enough to embrace it. The story of Taju lives on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that miracles are real and love is the most powerful force in any universe. And on quiet evenings, when the mango tree rustles its leaves in the breeze and the talking drums sing their ancient songs, those who know how to listen can still hear the echo of paws on muddy ground, carrying hope through the darkness toward home.